Security guards warned him to stay away from the rich girl in the wheelchair. But when she suddenly stood up during dinner, her father couldn't believe what the gardener's son had done. Anthony's sneakers crunched on the gravel path at 5:30 a.m. His worn shoes left wet prints on the stones as he pushed his grandmother's old wheelbarrow through the morning dew. The gardens of Greenwich's mansion district stretched out ahead of him, a maze of perfectly trimmed hedges and marble fountains. He stopped at the iron gates of the Thompson estate, punching in a service entrance code with fingers that still felt stiff from the cold. The wheelbarrow's wheel squeaked as he pushed it through. Security cameras tracked his movement, their red lights blinking in the dim morning light. "Hey, kid," a sharp voice called out. "Show your ID." Anthony reached into his pocket, pulling out the laminated card. The security guard, Matthews, stepped closer, flashlight beam hitting Anthony's face. "New protocol. Sign in every morning now." "Yes, sir." Anthony's voice stayed steady as he wrote his name in the logbook. The guard watched every stroke of his pen. A fleet of black SUVs rolled past the main entrance, taking kids his age to private school, their pressed uniforms and leather bags visible through tinted windows. Anthony kept his eyes on his wheelbarrow. "Stay in the designated areas," Matthews said. "Mr. Thompson has important guests today." Inside the garden shed, Anthony changed into his work boots. His grandmother had patched the hole in the left one last week, her fingers trembling as she pushed the needle through the tough leather. The memory of her pain made his chest tight. "I'll be home early to help with your exercises, Gran," he'd promised that morning, watching her struggle to grip her coffee mug. The shed's radio crackled with the morning weather report as Anthony gathered his tools. Through the window, he caught movement on the mansion's back patio. A girl in a wheelchair sat alone, staring at nothing while a physical therapist attempted to engage her attention. "Emma, please try to focus," the therapist said, her voice carrying across the quiet garden. "These exercises are important for your recovery." The girl, Emma, turned her head away. Even from a distance, Anthony could see the defeat in her posture. The therapist sighed, checking her watch. "Perhaps we should end early today," she said. Emma didn't respond. Anthony trimmed hedges near the patio, keeping his head down. The squeak of Emma's wheelchair as she was pushed back inside made him think of his grandmother's walker. Last night, he'd found her medical bills stuffed in a kitchen drawer. The numbers had made his stomach drop. Her arthritis medication costs were going up again. The envelope of cash from his garden work felt too light in his pocket. The morning wore on. Anthony's arms ached as he pruned roses and pulled weeds. Other workers arrived, gardeners, housekeepers, maintenance staff. They nodded to him, but kept their distance. He was used to it. A commotion from inside the mansion drew his attention. Emma's voice, raised in frustration. "I don't want another therapist. They all say the same useless things." "Miss Emma, please." A maid's placating tone. "Just leave me alone." Anthony's hands stilled on his pruning shears. He watched through the patio doors as Emma wheeled herself furiously away from the concerned staff. Her path took her toward the garden. On instinct, Anthony stepped back, making himself smaller behind the rose bushes. But Emma didn't come outside. She stopped at the glass doors, one hand pressed against them as she stared out at the garden. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Anthony saw his own loneliness reflected back at him. Then Emma's father's voice boomed from inside. "Where is she?" "Emma, the new therapist is here to meet you." Emma's wheelchair spun around. The moment broke. Anthony returned to his roses, but his mind kept spinning. That evening, his grandmother showed him a new way to massage her swollen joints. "It's all about the pressure points," she explained, guiding his fingers. "Too much force hurts. Too little doesn't help. You have to find the right balance." Anthony listened carefully, watching how her pain eased as he followed her instructions. The techniques were simple but precise. Like pruning roses, you had to know exactly where to make the cut. Later, lying in bed, he heard the staff at the Thompson mansion talking about Emma through his open window. "Poor girl hasn't been the same since the accident. Lost her mother, her legs." Mr. Thompson's at his wit's end with all these therapists. Anthony stared at his ceiling, thinking about pressure points and balance. About his grandmother's gentle hands, teaching him to help her walk. about Emma's eyes through the glass, full of the same pain he saw in his grandmother's on bad days. He made his decision. Tomorrow he would try to help. The moon cast shadows through his window, bars of light across his worn bedroom floor. In one corner, his school backpack sat next to his garden tools. Two worlds that never quite seemed to fit together. But maybe, just maybe, he had found a way to bridge them. Anthony closed his eyes, his grandmother's words echoing in his mind. Sometimes the simplest touch can make all the difference. You just have to be brave enough to reach out. Tomorrow he would be brave. Anthony arrived earlier than usual the next morning. The Thompson mansion's windows were still dark, except for the pool area where Emma's therapy sessions took place. He positioned himself near the hydrangea bushes, close enough to observe while pretending to work. The therapy session started like yesterday. Emma sat in her wheelchair, face blank as the therapist demonstrated leg exercises. "You need to try, Emma," the therapist said, her patience wearing thin. "Your muscles will atrophy if you don't move them." Emma stared at the pool's surface. "What's the point?" The words hit Anthony hard. He'd heard that tone before, 2 years ago, when his grandmother first got her diagnosis. "I'm useless now," she'd said, dropping a plate her arthritic fingers couldn't grip. "Maybe it's time I moved to a home." Anthony had knelt beside her that day, picking up broken pieces of ceramic. "You're not going anywhere, Gran. We'll figure this out together." Now, watching Emma, his hands remembered every technique his grandmother had taught him. The gentle circular motions that loosened stiff joints. The careful stretches that built strength without causing pain. The therapist packed up early again, leaving Emma alone by the pool. Anthony waited until the woman disappeared inside before stepping out from behind the hydrangeas. "Your legs aren't getting the right kind of movement," he said quietly. Emma's head snapped up. "What did you say?" "The exercises she's showing you. They're too aggressive. You need to start smaller." "And what would you know about it?" Emma's voice was sharp, defensive. Anthony took a step closer. "My grandmother has severe arthritis. I help her move every day. Sometimes the big movements hurt too much at first. You have to start with little ones." A shadow fell across them. Step away from Miss Thompson. Matthews, the security guard, appeared between them. "Now, I was just Dash. This is your only warning, kid. Stay in the garden areas or find another job." Anthony backed away, heart pounding. Emma watched him go, something flickering in her eyes. Curiosity maybe, or just surprise. That evening, his grandmother's hands shook as she tried to button her sweater. Anthony sat with her, demonstrating the finger exercises they developed together. "Remember how scared you were at first?" he asked, supporting her wrist. "You thought moving would make it worse. And you were so patient," she smiled. "My little doctor." "I'm no doctor, Gran. Just trying to help. Sometimes that's all it takes." She looked at him closely. "Something on your mind?" Anthony hesitated. "There's this girl at work. She's in a wheelchair. The therapists are pushing her too hard, but no one listens to her." His grandmother's fingers closed around his. "Like no one listened to me at first? Until you did." "Yeah, but the security guard said Dash. Since when do guards know about healing?" She squeezed his hand. "You have a gift, Anthony. Not just the techniques, but the patience, the understanding." The next day, Anthony watched Emma's session from a different spot. When she grimaced during a particular stretch, he recognized the pain in her expression. It was the same look his grandmother got when movements were too sudden. During her water break, Emma's eyes found him. She wheeled herself to the edge of the pool area. "Hey," she called softly. "Garden boy." Anthony approached cautiously, watching for Matthews. "Yesterday," Emma said, "you mentioned starting smaller. What did you mean?" "It's like—" Anthony glanced around, then knelt beside her wheelchair. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Emma nodded. "The therapists always start here." He demonstrated the wide motion they used. "But if you begin here instead—" He showed her a gentler movement, one he'd learned for his grandmother's bad days. Emma's eyes widened slightly. "That doesn't hurt. It's not supposed to. Pain makes you tense up, fighting against the movement. You have to build trust with your body first." "Trust," Emma repeated. The words seemed to catch in her throat. "I haven't trusted anything since the accident. Since Mom—" She stopped abruptly. Anthony saw the familiar shadow of loss cross her face. I was 7 when my parents left, he said quietly. Just walked out one day. Never came back. Emma looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. How do you trust anything after that? You start small, Anthony said. Like the exercises. One movement at a time. Miss Emma. A sharp voice cut through their conversation. The head of security strode toward them. Matthews close behind. What did we tell you about bothering Miss Thompson? Matthews grabbed Anthony's arm. He wasn't bothering me, Emma protested. He was helping. Your father's instructions were very clear, the head of security said. No unauthorized contact with staff. Especially not Dash, he stopped, but Anthony heard the unspoken words. Especially not the black gardener's kid? Anthony pulled his arm free. I was just showing her Dash. One more word and you're fired, Matthews warned. Back to the gardens. Now. Anthony walked away, fists clenched. Behind him, he heard Emma saying, You can't treat people like that. He was only trying to help, but he knew it wouldn't matter. It never did. That night, he helped his grandmother into bed, her joints particularly stiff from the cold weather. Maybe I should quit, he said, adjusting her pillows. Find work somewhere else. Is that what you want to do? Anthony thought of Emma's face when he showed her the gentle movements. The first spark of hope he'd seen in her eyes. No, he admitted, but they won't let me help. His grandmother touched his cheek. Then you'll have to find another way. You always do. Anthony lay awake that night planning, if he couldn't talk to Emma directly, maybe there were other ways to share what he knew. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd try again. The moon cast long shadows across his room as he finally drifted off, his mind full of careful movements and small beginnings. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest steps. His grandmother had taught him that. Anthony started leaving notes in Emma's favorite garden spot before dawn. Simple instructions written on the back of old garden supply receipts, tucked under a loose stone by the pool. Try rotating your ankles in small circles. Flex your toes while watching TV. Gentle stretches before bed help prevent stiffness. He watched from behind the tool shed as Emma found the first note. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read it, looking around to see who might have left it. Then she slipped it into her pocket, away from the watchful eyes of the staff. Days passed. More notes appeared. Start with 5 minutes. Stop if it hurts. Remember to breathe through the movements. Patience is part of healing. One morning, Anthony arrived to find a reply scratched hastily on a crumpled piece of paper. The ankle rotations helped. What else? He smiled, remembering teaching his grandmother these same techniques. That evening, she noticed his improved mood as he helped her with her exercises. Your hands are steadier today, she said, watching him massage her swollen knuckles. I think I'm getting better at this. The helping or the sneaking around? Anthony's hands froze. How did you dash? I'm old, not blind. She patted his cheek. You've been writing notes every night. Just be careful, baby. People don't always understand good intentions. A loud crash from the kitchen interrupted them. Anthony found his grandmother's favorite mug shattered on the floor, her hands shaking too badly to hold it. The medicine's not working like it used to, she admitted, tears in her eyes. And we can't afford to increase the dose. Anthony held her while she cried, his mind racing through calculations. His garden wages barely covered their current expenses. The new prescription would cost twice as much. The next morning, he noticed changes in Emma's therapy sessions. She incorporated his suggested movements between the therapist's exercises, her face set in concentration. The therapist noticed too. Your muscle tone is improving, she said, surprised. Have you been doing extra exercises? Emma shrugged. Just practicing what you showed me. But Anthony saw the difference. Her movements were smoother, more confident. She was learning to trust her body again, one small motion at a time. Then came the breakthrough. Anthony was trimming hedges when he heard a gasp from the pool area. Emma had grabbed the therapy bars and pulled herself up. For 3 seconds, she stood on shaking legs. I did it, she whispered. Then louder, I did it. The therapist rushed over. Emma, that's incredible. But how dash? Emma sank back in her wheelchair, her face glowing. I've been working on building strength gradually. Like you said, the therapist frowned. I never suggested that approach. In fact, your progress pattern is completely different from our usual methods. Anthony's stomach tightened. He ducked behind the hedges as the therapist called other staff members over, pointing out changes in Emma's muscle response and flexibility. That afternoon, whispers spread through the mansion. The household manager questioned the therapy team. The security guards reviewed camera footage. Anthony kept his head down, focusing on his work, but he felt their suspicious glances. Someone's been interfering with Miss Thompson's therapy. He overheard Matthews telling another guard. Mr. Thompson wants answers. That evening, Anthony helped his grandmother into bed, his mind heavy with decisions. The envelope of cash from his wages felt thinner than ever. Maybe I should quit, he said, adjusting her pillows. Find work somewhere else? His grandmother caught his hand. Is that what your heart tells you to do? Before he could answer, she doubled over in pain. Her arthritis was flaring badly, the joints in her hands swollen and hot to the touch. Anthony ran to get her medicine, only to find the bottle almost empty. I'll figure something out, he promised, helping her take the last pill. We'll get through this. But as he watched her finally drift into uneasy sleep, fear gripped his chest. Without this job, they couldn't afford her medication. Without her medication, the pain would only get worse. The next morning, Emma was waiting by his usual garden spot. She wheeled herself over as soon as she saw him. Thank you, she whispered. For the notes. For understanding. Before Anthony could respond, a shadow fell over them. The head of security stood there, Emma's therapy notes in his hand. Mr. Thompson wants to see you, he said coldly. Now. Emma started to protest, but Anthony shook his head slightly. This confrontation had been inevitable from the start. As he followed the security guard toward the mansion's main entrance, Anthony thought of his grandmother's words. People don't always understand good intentions. He was about to find out just how true that was. Behind him, Emma called out, Wait, I can explain everything. But the mansion's heavy doors had already closed behind them, sealing Anthony's fate with a final, echoing thud. Anthony stood in Mr. Thompson's study, trying not to stare at the leather-bound books lining walls that stretched higher than his entire apartment. Security cameras had been installed in every corner of the room, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Sit, Mr. Thompson commanded from behind his massive desk. He held the stack of therapy notes in his manicured hands. Anthony sat on the edge of a chair that probably cost more than his grandmother's monthly medication. Matthew stood by the door, arms crossed. Explain these, Mr. Thompson said, spreading the notes across his desk. They're exercise instructions, sir. And what made you think you were qualified to give my daughter medical advice? Before Anthony could answer, the door burst open. Emma wheeled herself in, breathing hard. Dad, stop. He was helping me. Emma, please wait outside. No. Emma moved her wheelchair closer to Anthony. The regular therapy wasn't working. Everything hurt too much. But his exercises, she gestured to the notes. They made sense. They let me build strength without pain. Mr. Thompson's jaw tightened. You have professional therapists, who don't listen. Emma's voice cracked. They push and push, but Anthony understood. Like he said, you have to trust your body first. And how exactly does a gardener's boy know so much about physical therapy? Matthews interjected. Anthony straightened in his chair. My grandmother has severe arthritis. I help her move every day. We learn what works through trial and error. Your grandmother. Mr. Thompson's tone was skeptical. And these techniques just happen to work for my daughter's completely different condition? The principles are similar, Anthony explained, trying to keep his voice steady. Start small. Build confidence. Listen to the body's signals. A knock interrupted them. The head therapist entered, carrying Emma's progress charts. Mr. Thompson, you need to see this. Emma's improvement over the past weeks is remarkable. Her muscle tone, flexibility, even her confidence. Everything's better than we've seen since the accident. Emma touched Anthony's arm. Show them. Show them what you taught me. For the next 20 minutes, Anthony demonstrated the gentle exercises he developed with his grandmother. He explained each movement, the reasoning behind it, how it built upon the previous one. The therapist watched intently, taking notes. These methods are unorthodox, but they're working, especially for someone Emma's age. The gradual progression allows for better psychological adaptation. Mr. Thompson's expression remained hard. That doesn't change the fact that an unqualified minor was secretly interfering with my daughter's medical treatment. Dad, please, Emma pleaded. For the first time since Mom, she swallowed hard. For the first time, I feel hope. The room fell silent at the mention of Emma's mother. Anthony saw pain flash across Mr. Thompson's face. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Through the study's window, Anthony saw his grandmother getting out of a taxi, leaning heavily on her walker. Gran? He stood up. What's she doing here? I called her, Emma said quietly. She deserves to be part of this conversation. Matthews moved to block the door, but Mr. Thompson waved him aside. Moments later, Anthony's grandmother was helped into the study by a maid. Mrs. Walker, Mr. Thompson began, but she cut him off. First, let me show you something. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing swollen joints. 2 years ago, I couldn't even hold a spoon. The doctors gave me exercises that hurt too much to follow. But Anthony, she smiled at her grandson. He learned to read my pain, to work with it, not against it. Everything he taught your daughter came from hours of patient practice. She turned to the therapist. Test his knowledge. Ask him anything about joint mobility, pain management, graduated exercise progression. My grandson has lived this every day for years. The next hour became an impromptu examination. The therapist questioned Anthony about his methods, their development, the reasoning behind each progression. Emma demonstrated the results, showing how she could now stand for short periods, how her range of motion had improved. Finally, Mr. Thompson held up his hand. Enough. He looked exhausted. Emma, are you absolutely certain about this? Dad, watch. Emma gripped her wheelchair's arms, and with careful movements Anthony had taught her, pushed herself to standing. She held the position for 10 seconds, a new record. Mr. Thompson's face softened slightly. The dinner party tonight? Can you show them? Emma nodded. I think I'm ready. Very well. Mr. Thompson turned to Anthony. You may continue assisting with Emma's therapy under professional supervision. But everything goes through proper channels now. No more secret notes? Yes, sir. Anthony helped his grandmother up. Thank you. As they left the study, Emma caught his hand. Tonight's dinner party. Will you be there? Please. Anthony looked at Mr. Thompson, who nodded reluctantly. That evening, Anthony stood in the corner of the Thompsons' dining room, wearing his one good shirt. His grandmother sat beside him, proudly watching the scene unfold. The room was filled with Greenwich's elite, doctors, lawyers, business executives. Emma sat in her wheelchair at the table's head, waiting for the right moment. During the main course, she caught Anthony's eye. He nodded slightly. Emma pushed back from the table. Conversation stopped as she gripped the chair arms slowly, steadily. She rose to standing. Gasps filled the room. Mr. Thompson's fork clattered against his plate. Oh my God, someone whispered. It's a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle, Anthony thought. It was hard work, patience, and understanding. It was his grandmother's wisdom passed down. It was trust built one small movement at a time. Emma stayed standing for 15 seconds before sitting back down. The room erupted in applause and questions. How did this happen? Which doctor helped you? What treatment did you use? Emma's voice cut through the chaos. Him? She pointed to Anthony. He taught me to walk again. The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned to stare at the black teenager in the corner. Anthony felt their judgment, their disbelief. Then his grandmother struggled to her feet. Using the techniques Anthony had taught her, she walked slowly to Emma's side. Sometimes, she announced to the room, the best healers aren't the ones with fancy degrees. They're the ones who understand pain, who've lived with it, who've learned to work through it. She took Anthony's hand, pulling him forward. My grandson may not have credentials, but he has something just as valuable. Empathy, patience, and a gift for healing. The silence stretched on. Anthony could feel his future balancing on this moment, like Emma balancing on her strengthening legs. Then Mr. Thompson stood up. Perhaps, he said slowly, it's time we reconsidered our approach to Emma's treatment. The morning after the dinner party, Anthony found himself back in Mr. Thompson's study. This time, though, the atmosphere felt different. The security cameras were gone. Matthews wasn't hovering by the door. Instead, Emma sat beside him, her wheelchair positioned near her father's desk. "Show me everything," Mr. Thompson said, his voice quieter than yesterday. From the beginning, Anthony pulled out his worn notebook, its pages filled with sketches and notes from 2 years of helping his grandmother. "It started with hands," he explained, opening to the first page. "Gran couldn't hold her coffee cup anymore. The doctor's exercises were too aggressive, so we made our own system." He laid out his hand-drawn diagrams, careful illustrations of finger joints, wrist movements, pressure points. Each page showed the progression, from simple flexes to more complex movements. "These dates," the therapist noted, pointing to Anthony's careful documentation. "You tracked everything." "Had to," Anthony replied. "Some days were better than others. We needed to know what worked." Emma wheeled closer, studying the drawings. "Like my leg exercises. Small movements first, then building up." "Exactly." Anthony turned to a newer section. "After I saw your therapy sessions, I adapted Gran's techniques. The principles are the same. Start with what doesn't hurt, build trust, then gradually increase difficulty." Mr. Thompson picked up one of the diagrams. "And where did you learn to draw these?" "Biology class," Anthony answered. "My teacher let me stay after school to use the anatomy books. Said I had a natural understanding of body mechanics." A knock at the door interrupted them. Anthony's grandmother entered, moving more smoothly than usual. "Perfect timing," the therapist said. "Mrs. Walker, would you mind demonstrating some of these movements?" For the next hour, Anthony and his grandmother showed the progression of exercises they'd developed. He explained each modification, each careful adjustment they'd made over time. "The first few months were the hardest," his grandmother added. "Some days I wanted to give up." "But Anthony," she smiled at him. "He said something I'll never forget. Pain isn't the enemy. Giving up is." Emma nodded. "That's what he wrote in one of his notes to me." Mr. Thompson leaned forward. "Anthony, why didn't you tell us about your experience sooner?" Anthony's hands tightened on his notebook. "Would you have listened, sir? A kid from the gardens, telling your expensive therapist they were doing it wrong." The room fell silent. Emma reached for Anthony's arm, but he stood up, moving to the window. "The day my mother left," he said quietly, staring out at the gardens, "she said she couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Gran's arthritis was getting worse. We needed money for treatments. Mom said. She said some people aren't meant to be healers." His voice cracked slightly. "I was 7. Watched her pack her bags, walk out the door. Dad had already gone months before. Gran could barely move, but she held me all night. Said we'd figure it out together." He turned back to face the room. "That's when I started learning. Reading everything I could about joint problems, movement therapy. The library had medical books. I studied them during lunch breaks at school. Because if I could help Gran move again, maybe she wouldn't leave too." Emma finished softly. Anthony nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Show them your journal," his grandmother urged. "The real one?" Anthony hesitated, then reached into his backpack. He pulled out a battered composition book, its pages swollen with years of use. "Every day," he explained, opening it carefully, "I wrote down what we tried. What worked, what didn't. Gran's pain levels, weather conditions, everything that might affect her mobility." The therapist took the journal reverently. This is incredible. The detail, the observations." She looked at Mr. Thompson. "This is better documentation than most clinical trials." Mr. Thompson studied Anthony for a long moment. "You developed all this to help your grandmother, then adapted it for Emma. Why?" "Because I saw the same look in Emma's eyes," Anthony said simply. "The one that says, nothing will ever get better. Gran had that look once. I couldn't stand seeing it again." Emma wheeled herself to Anthony's side. "Dad, remember what Mom used to say? Sometimes angels come disguised as people who simply care enough to help." Mr. Thompson's face softened at his late wife's words. He stood up, walking to a photograph on his desk, a woman with Emma's smile, taken before the accident. "Your mother would have liked you," he told Anthony quietly. "She always saw beyond appearances, beyond status. Saw people's hearts instead." He turned to the therapist. "What's your professional opinion?" "His methods are unconventional," she admitted, "but the results speak for themselves." Both Mrs. Walker and Emma have shown remarkable improvement. In his documentation, she held up the journal. This shows a natural gift for therapeutic progression. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. Then perhaps it's time we made this official. He pressed his intercom. Janet, please bring in the papers we discussed. His secretary entered with a folder. Mr. Thompson opened it, revealing official-looking documents. This is a proposal, he explained. We would like you to join Emma's therapy team officially. Under professional supervision, of course. You would be compensated properly for your time and expertise. Anthony stared at the papers. Sir, there's more. Mr. Thompson pulled out another document. Your grandmother's medical bills. The treatment she needs, the medication. Consider it taken care of. Mr. Thompson, we can't accept dash, Anthony's grandmother started. Helen, Mr. Thompson interrupted, using her first name. Your grandson has given my daughter something priceless. Hope. Please, let me do this. Anthony felt Emma's hand slip into his. He looked down at their joined fingers, her pale skin against his dark, both of them trembling slightly with emotion. One condition, he said finally. I keep working in the gardens too. That's where this all started, where I learned patience, watching things grow. Mr. Thompson smiled, his first real smile since the meetings began. The gardens will always be part of your story, Anthony. Just like they're part of Emma's recovery now. Later that evening, Anthony sat with his grandmother on their small porch, watching the sunset. The therapy journal lay open between them, its pages catching the golden light. You know what this means? She asked softly. You can finally start thinking about medical school. Your dream. Anthony touched the journal's worn cover. One step at a time, Gran. Like we always say. Inside, Emma's therapy schedule for tomorrow waited on his desk, officially approved. Next to it lay his garden tools, cleaned and ready for the morning. Two worlds finally coming together. Just like a young boy had hoped they would, all those years ago when he first learned to help gentle hands hold coffee cups again. The therapy room felt different from the gardens. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating exercise equipment and padded mats. Anthony stood beside the head therapist, Dr. Sarah Chun, watching Emma prepare for their first official session. Ready? He asked, offering his hand as Emma transferred from her wheelchair to the parallel bars. Ready? Her grip was stronger now, more confident. Dr. Chun observed from nearby, clipboard in hand. Remember, Anthony, walk me through every step. First, we check joint mobility, Anthony explained, gently supporting Emma's elbow. Emma, small circles with your ankles like we practiced. Emma demonstrated, her movements smooth and controlled. Dr. Chun made notes, nodding approvingly. Now the weight transfer, Anthony continued. 10 seconds on each leg. Remember to breathe. Emma gripped the bars, shifting her weight carefully. Her legs trembled slightly, but held. Good, Anthony encouraged. Just like Gran does it. Focus on your center. Speaking of your grandmother, Dr. Chun interjected. How is she responding to the new medication? Anthony smiled. Better than ever. She made breakfast by herself this morning. First time in years. Emma beamed. Dad said she's coming for dinner tonight. We can show her my progress. They worked steadily through the exercise routine. Anthony demonstrated each movement first, explaining the purpose and progression. Dr. Chun took detailed notes, occasionally asking questions about his methodology. Your understanding of biomechanics is remarkable, she commented. Have you considered pursuing formal training? Before Anthony could answer, Matthews appeared at the door. His attitude had changed since the dinner party, less hostile, though still reserved. Mr. Thompson would like an update, he announced. Perfect timing, Dr. Chun replied. Emma, show your father what you've been working on. Emma nodded, repositioning herself at the bars. Anthony stood ready to spot her, but she waved him back. I've got this, she said confidently. Everyone watched as Emma gripped the bars. With careful, deliberate movements, she began to walk. One step, then another. Her technique wasn't perfect, but her progress was undeniable. Mr. Thompson entered just as Emma reached the halfway point. He stopped in the doorway, watching his daughter move with growing confidence. The isolation exercises are paying off, Dr. Chun explained. Anthony's method of breaking down complex movements into smaller components has accelerated her progress significantly. Emma reached the end of the bars, turning slowly to face her father. Sweat shone on her forehead, but her eyes sparkled with achievement. "Did you see, Dad? All the way down and back." Mr. Thompson crossed the room in quick strides, hugging his daughter carefully. "I saw, sweetheart. I saw everything." Over Emma's shoulder, he caught Anthony's eye. "Thank you," he mouthed silently. The rest of the session focused on strengthening exercises. Anthony demonstrated movements he developed with his grandmother, adapted for Emma's condition. "The key is understanding pain signals," he explained to Dr. Chen. "Different types of pain mean different things. You have to learn to read them, like a language," Emma added. "That's what Anthony taught me. Some pain means stop, some means slow down, some means you're getting stronger." Dr. Chen looked impressed. "Most trained therapists take years to develop that level of intuition." "I had a good teacher," Anthony said, thinking of his grandmother's patience through their years of trial and error. Later that afternoon, Anthony returned to the gardens. The familiar work of pruning and weeding felt therapeutic after the intensity of the therapy session. Emma watched from the patio, practicing her ankle exercises while she read a book. The staff no longer gave them suspicious looks. Instead, several stopped to congratulate Emma on her progress. "Young man," a voice called. Anthony turned to see the head groundskeeper approaching. "Sir, got something to show you." The man led Anthony to the tool shed. Inside, a new section had been cleared and organized. Mr. Thompson ordered this set up. Said you need a proper place to store your therapy equipment. Anthony stared at the space, clean, well-lit, with shelves for his notebooks and diagrams, a far cry from hiding notes under rocks. "There's more," the groundskeeper added. "We're converting part of the greenhouse into a winter therapy space. Mr. Thompson wants you involved in the design." Before Anthony could respond, he heard excited voices from the patio. Emma was showing his grandmother her walking progress, both of them laughing as she took small but steady steps. "Look who's up and moving," his grandmother called. She was using her walker less now, her own movements more fluid thanks to the new medication. Anthony joined them, watching proudly as Emma demonstrated her improved balance. Next week, Emma announced, "I'm going back to school. Part-time at first, but still." "That's wonderful, dear," his grandmother smiled. "Anthony told me you've been working extra hard." "Show her the long walk," Anthony suggested. Emma's face lit up. "Follow me." They made their way to the garden path, the same one where Anthony had first observed Emma's therapy sessions. The stone walkway stretched ahead, dappled with late afternoon sunlight. Emma gripped her parallel walking bars, a portable set her father had ordered. With Anthony on one side and his grandmother on the other, she began to walk. Step by step, they moved down the path. Emma's movements were stronger now, more coordinated. She barely needed the bars for support. Almost there, Anthony encouraged as they approached the end. Emma took the final steps and turned, triumphant. "That's the furthest I've ever gone." And without stopping, his grandmother added proudly. They heard applause. Mr. Thompson stood nearby with Dr. Chen, both smiling broadly. "The board members want to meet him," they overheard Mr. Thompson telling Dr. Chen. "They're interested in implementing his methods in other therapy programs." Dr. Chen nodded. "His techniques could help a lot of people." With proper training, Anthony pretended not to hear, focusing instead on Emma's cool-down exercises. But his grandmother squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. That evening, they celebrated with dinner in the Thompsons' formal dining room, the same room where, just weeks ago, Anthony had stood nervously in the corner. Now he sat at the table, between his grandmother and Emma, sharing stories and plans for the future. "To new beginnings," Mr. Thompson toasted, raising his glass. Anthony looked around the table, at Emma's confident smile, his grandmother's easy movements, the acceptance in the faces that had once viewed him with suspicion. And to small steps, he added quietly, thinking of all the tiny movements that had led to this moment. Emma reached for his hand under the table. "That lead to big changes," she finished. Through the dining room windows, Anthony could see the gardens where it all began. The setting sun painted the flowers in shades of gold, like nature itself was celebrating their victory. One small step at a time, he thought. That's how healing happens. That's how barriers break down. That's how hope grows, like seeds planted in fertile soil, just waiting for the right moment to bloom. Emma sat in her wheelchair outside the school board meeting room, fidgeting with her skirt. Anthony stood beside her, both of them listening to the muffled voices inside. "What if I fall?" Emma whispered. "Then I'll help you up," Anthony replied simply. "Just like we practiced." The door opened. Dr. Chun beckoned them in. "They're ready." The room fell silent as they entered. School board members sat around a long table, along with Emma's teachers and Mr. Thompson. At the center sat the district superintendent, reviewing Emma's medical files. "Miss Thompson," the superintendent began, "your father tells us you're ready to return to school." Emma straightened in her wheelchair. "Yes, sir. Perhaps you could demonstrate your progress?" Anthony moved forward with the portable walking bars, setting them up quickly. He'd done this so many times now. The movements were automatic. "Remember," he murmured to Emma, just like in the garden, "focus on your breathing." Emma gripped the bars. The room watched as she slowly pushed herself up, her legs steady beneath her. Anthony stood ready to spot her, but kept his distance. She needed to do this herself. One step, then another. Emma's face showed intense concentration as she walked the length of the bars. At the end, she paused, then turned around without sitting down. "I can go back too," she announced, and began the return journey. The superintendent leaned forward, clearly impressed. Several board members whispered among themselves. "Remarkable," one teacher said. When she left school, she could barely sit up in her wheelchair. Emma completed the walk, lowering herself carefully back into her chair. Her face glowed with achievement. "Tell us about your recovery process," the superintendent requested. Emma gestured to Anthony. "He made it possible. He taught me to trust my body again." "The gardener's boy?" A board member raised her eyebrows. "The talented therapist," Mr. Thompson corrected firmly, "who helped my daughter walk when traditional methods failed." Dr. Chin stepped forward, presenting her clinical documentation. Anthony's techniques are innovative yet grounded in solid therapeutic principles. His success rate with both Emma and his grandmother speaks for itself. The board reviewed the materials. Anthony stood quietly, remembering similar moments of judgment. But this time felt different. This time he had results to show, supporters in his corner. "Miss Thompson," the superintendent said finally, "we see no reason why you can't return to classes next week. Part-time initially, with accommodations as needed." Emma grabbed Anthony's hand, squeezing tight. "However," the superintendent continued, looking at Anthony, "we're also interested in learning more about your therapeutic methods. The district has several students who might benefit from your approach." Anthony blinked in surprise. "Sir, we'd like to establish a pilot program. Under proper supervision, of course. Dr. Chen has offered to oversee it." Mr. Thompson stood up, which brings us to the next item. "Anthony, remember that scholarship we discussed?" From his briefcase, Mr. Thompson pulled out an envelope. "The board has reviewed your academic record. Your grades in biology and anatomy are particularly impressive. Combined with your practical experience." Anthony opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was an acceptance letter to a prestigious medical training program. "It's accelerated," Mr. Thompson explained. "You'll study while continuing to work with Emma and developing the pilot program. All expenses covered." Anthony stared at the letter, his vision blurring slightly. He felt Emma's hand slip into his again. "Say yes," she whispered. "You've earned this." Later that afternoon, Anthony helped his grandmother up the stairs to their apartment. Her movements were smoother now, weeks of proper medication showing results. "I have news," he said, showing her the letter. She read it slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "Your mama was wrong," she said finally. "You were meant to be a healer. Always were. I had a good teacher." Anthony hugged her gently. "You never gave up on me, and you never gave up on anyone else." She touched his cheek. "That's your real gift, baby. Not just the techniques, but the heart behind them." Their moment was interrupted by a knock. Emma stood in the doorway, supported by her walking bars. "Sorry," she grinned. Door was open. "Had to show you, I made it up all the stairs." Anthony's grandmother clapped in delight. Come in, come in. This calls for celebration." They sat in the small kitchen, sharing tea and cookies. Emma looked around curiously. Her first time in their home. "It's different from our house," she observed. "But it feels warmer somehow." "That's because it's full of love," Anthony's grandmother said simply. "And healing." Speaking of healing, Emma set down her cup. "I want to help with the pilot program. I can show other kids it's possible, that they don't have to give up." Anthony nodded. "We could work together, share what we've learned, about more than just walking," Emma added softly. "About trust, about believing in yourself." Anthony's grandmother watched them with knowing eyes. Sometimes the best medicine isn't in pills or fancy equipment. Sometimes it's in understanding, in patience, in believing someone when they say, "I'll help you up if you fall." They spent the evening planning, Emma contributing ideas for the program, Anthony sketching out exercise progressions, his grandmother offering wisdom from her own journey. Through the window, they could see the lights of Greenwich's Mansion district glowing in the distance. But here in this small kitchen, something bigger was growing, something that started with a boy helping his grandmother hold a coffee cup and led to a girl learning to walk again. Something that proved healing could bridge any divide if you just took it one step at a time. As the evening wound down, Emma prepared to leave. Standing at the door, supported by her bars but standing tall, she looked back at Anthony. "Tomorrow's my first full day back at school," she said. "Will you be there? In case I need help?" Anthony glanced at his grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. "Every step of the way," he promised. After Emma left, Anthony sat with his grandmother on their small balcony. The acceptance letter lay between them, its official seal catching the last light of day. "Scared?" she asked softly. "A little," he admitted. "It's a big change. Remember what you always tell Emma? Small steps." Anthony smiled, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, school boards to convince, programs to develop, studies to begin. But tonight, in this moment, he felt ready for whatever came next. Because he'd learned the most important lesson of all. Healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something stronger in its place. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Anthony walked Marcus, the new garden assistant, through the daily routine. The teenager watched intently as Anthony demonstrated proper pruning techniques. "Remember," Anthony explained, "like the therapy work, it's all about patience and attention to detail." "I still can't believe you're leaving the gardens," Marcus said, taking the shears. "Not leaving completely, just splitting my time differently now." Anthony watched Marcus make his first cut. "Good, just like that." The sound of footsteps made them turn. Emma walked toward them. No wheelchair, no bars, just a simple cane for balance. "Look who's up early," Anthony smiled. "Had to see if you were actually training my new gardener properly." Emma pretended to inspect Marcus's work. "Not bad, though nobody prunes roses quite like Anthony." Marcus grinned. "He said the same thing about you and those walking exercises." "Speaking of which," Emma turned to Anthony. "The new group starts today. You ready?" The pilot program had grown faster than anyone expected. Word spread through Greenwich about Emma's recovery, and soon other families reached out. Kids with various mobility issues, all hoping to benefit from Anthony's methods. "Almost," Anthony replied. "Just need to finish up here." He spent the next hour showing Marcus the remaining garden tasks. The younger boy was a quick learner, eager to prove himself. "This job changed my life too," Marcus said quietly as they put away the tools. "My mom cried when Mr. Thompson hired me." Anthony squeezed his shoulder. "You earned it. Just remember, Dash, I know, Marcus laughed. Patience and attention to detail. Inside the mansion's converted therapy room, Emma was already working with their first new student, a 12-year-old girl named Sarah, recovering from a gymnastics accident. "See?" Emma demonstrated a movement. "Small circles first, just like Anthony taught me." Sarah copied the motion, her face tight with concentration. "It doesn't hurt as much this way." "That's the idea," Anthony said, entering the room. "Pain isn't the goal. Control is." Throughout the morning, they worked with 4 different students. Emma shared her experience, showing them how far she'd come. Anthony guided them through his adapted exercises, watching for signs of progress or strain. During a break, Dr. Chen pulled him aside. The medical board is impressed with the preliminary results. They want to expand the program. Already? Anthony wiped his forehead. We've only been running it for 3 weeks. Success speaks for itself. Which reminds me, she handed him an envelope. Your acceptance package for the medical training program. Classes start next month. Anthony stared at the thick envelope. Inside was his future course schedules, reading lists, requirements for his path toward becoming a licensed therapist. Scared? Emma asked, joining them. Terrified, he admitted. It's a lot of change at once. Good thing you've got an excellent support system. She nudged his arm. Speaking of which, how's your grandmother doing in the new place? Mr. Thompson had helped them move to a ground-floor apartment closer to the hospital. No more stairs for his grandmother to struggle with, and better access to her medical care. She's hosting a coffee morning for the neighbors today, Anthony smiled. Said she never thought she'd be able to hold a coffee pot again. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's mother arriving for pickup. She watched in amazement as her daughter demonstrated her improved mobility. I don't understand, she said to Dr. Chen. We tried so many traditional therapists. Sometimes, Emma interjected, healing takes a different approach. Anthony taught me that. Later that afternoon, Anthony gave a presentation to the hospital board. His hand shook slightly as he laid out his methodology, but his voice remained steady. The key is individualization, he explained. Every patient's pain is unique. Their healing should be too. The board members asked questions about his techniques, his documentation methods, his results. Anthony answered each one, thinking of all the nights spent studying, all the careful observations noted in his journals. And you developed this while helping your grandmother? One doctor asked. Yes, sir. Necessity taught us what worked. Remarkable. The doctor made some notes. We'd like to integrate some of your methods into our standard physical therapy protocols. Anthony blinked. Really? With proper credit and compensation, of course. Afterward, he found Emma waiting outside. How'd it go? They want to use my methods. Officially, Emma hugged him. Of course they do. Because they work. She stepped back, studying his face. What's wrong? Anthony sighed. Just thinking about Mom. Wondering what she'd say if she could see all this. She was wrong about you, Emma said firmly. You're exactly what you were meant to be. They walked to Anthony's grandmother's new apartment. The coffee morning was just ending, neighbors chatting happily as they left. There's my boys, his grandmother called, seeing Anthony and Marcus. Come help an old lady clean up. As they cleared coffee cups and plates, she told them about her morning. Mrs. Jenkins next door has arthritis too. I showed her some of our exercises. Gran, Anthony groaned. You're not supposed to be giving medical advice. Not medical advice, she winked. Just one friend helping another. Like how this all started. Emma picked up a framed photo from the sideboard. Anthony at 7, sitting in the garden with his grandmother. Is this when you first started learning to help her? That's my little healer, his grandmother nodded. Even then, he knew exactly how to make the pain better. Anthony took the photo, remembering that day. How scared he'd been after his mother left. How determined to help his grandmother move again. I never thought it would lead to all this, he said quietly. That's the funny thing about helping others, his grandmother replied. You never know how far those ripples will spread. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mr. Thompson stood there with Dr. Chun and several official-looking people. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but we have some news that couldn't wait. They gathered in the small living room. Anthony, his grandmother, Emma, Marcus, all watching as Mr. Thompson unfolded some papers. The medical board has approved full funding for an expanded therapy program, he announced. With Anthony's methods as the foundation, Dr. Chin stepped forward. We want to establish a dedicated youth rehabilitation center. Using your combined experience, Anthony's techniques, Emma's peer support approach, all of it. But, Emma's father continued, we'll need someone to run it. Someone who understands both the medical and the human side of healing. He looked at Anthony. Once you complete your training, of course. Anthony sat down hard, overwhelmed. His grandmother gripped his hand. See, she whispered. Sometimes the best medicine is just having faith in someone. Emma moved to stand beside him, her cane forgotten against the wall. So, what do you say? Anthony looked around the room. At Marcus, eager to follow in his footsteps. At Emma, standing tall and strong. At his grandmother, beaming with pride. At Mr. Thompson and Dr. Chun, offering him a future he'd never dared imagine. I say, he smiled, we take it one step at a time. Just then, Sarah's mother called. Her daughter had managed to climb stairs alone for the first time since her accident. Another step forward, another small victory, another life changed. Just like it all began, with simple movements, patient hearts, and the courage to believe in healing's power to bridge any divide. Anthony stood outside the medical training center, adjusting his new backpack. The morning sun reflected off the building's glass windows, making the whole structure glow. You're going to be late on your first day if you keep staring, Emma said beside him. She'd insisted on coming, claiming she needed to make sure he actually went inside. Just taking it in, he replied. Still feels unreal. Well, it's very real. She gave him a gentle push toward the doors. Now go show them what you can do. Inside, the orientation room buzzed with activity. Other students filled the seats, some fresh from high school, others older, changing careers. Anthony found a spot near the front, trying to calm his racing heart. The program director stepped up to the podium. Welcome to your first day of medical training. Each of you brings unique experiences and perspectives to this field. Today, we'd like to hear them. One by one, students stood to introduce themselves. When Anthony's turn came, he rose slowly. I'm Anthony Walker, he began. I learned about healing by helping my grandmother with arthritis. Then I adapted those techniques to help others. I guess you could say I started my training in a garden. Yes, the director smiled. The Thompson case. We've incorporated some of your methods into our curriculum. Whispers rippled through the room. Anthony heard fragments. That story on the news? The gardener who helped that rich girl walk? But the whispers held admiration, not judgment. Times had changed. The morning passed in a blur of introductions and orientations. During lunch break, Anthony called his grandmother. How's my college man? She answered on the first ring. Doing fine, Gran. How's the new therapy group? Full house today. Emma's got them all motivated. That girl's a natural leader. After his mother left, Anthony had sworn he'd never trust Hope again. But life had other plans. Hope had found him anyway. In a garden, in a wheelchair-bound girl's determination, in his grandmother's unwavering faith. The afternoon brought their first practical session. The instructor demonstrated standard therapeutic techniques, then asked for alternative approaches. Anthony raised his hand. Sometimes traditional methods can be too aggressive. I've found that starting with micro-movements, he demonstrated the gentle exercises he developed, explaining the progression. Other students watched intently, taking notes. Excellent adaptation, the instructor praised. This kind of innovative thinking is exactly what the field needs. After classes ended, Anthony walked through the hospital's rehabilitation wing. These halls would become familiar over the next few years of training. In one room, he saw a young patient struggling with parallel bars, frustration clear on his face. Without thinking, Anthony stopped. Try shifting your weight first, he suggested. Small movements before big ones. The boy looked up surprised. His therapist turned. You must be Anthony, she smiled. Dr. Chun told us about you. Would you mind showing us that weight transfer technique? For the next hour, Anthony demonstrated his methods. The boy made his first real progress in weeks. How did you know? He asked Anthony. About starting small? Because someone taught me that healing isn't about big breakthroughs. It's about tiny victories that add up. At the mansion, Emma was leading her own therapy group. When Anthony arrived, she was showing 3 kids how to build confidence through graduated movements. Remember what Anthony taught me, she said. Pain isn't the enemy. Fear is. We're going to work through both together. She spotted him in the doorway and waved him in. Perfect timing. Come show them that balance exercise we developed. The kids looked at him with hope. The same hope he'd seen in Emma's eyes that first day in the garden. The same hope he'd fought to keep alive in himself. Later, they sat in the garden where it all began. Marcus had kept the roses beautifully pruned. Hard to believe it's only been a few months, Emma said, watching the sunset. Look how much has changed. Not everything, Anthony replied. The garden's still here, still teaching patience, and you're still helping people walk, just with fancier textbooks now. They laughed, remembering secret notes and hidden exercises. Now their methods were being studied, documented, shared. A car pulled up. Mr. Thompson and Anthony's grandmother, returning from a hospital board meeting about the new rehabilitation center. Construction starts next month, Mr. Thompson announced. The Thompson Walker Youth Rehabilitation Center. Walker. Anthony stared at him. Your grandmother's idea, he smiled. Said it was time your name got equal billing. Anthony helped his grandmother out of the car. Her movements were fluid now, years of pain managed through proper care and the techniques they'd pioneered together. Proud of you, baby, she whispered, hugging him. So proud. They all went inside for dinner. No more separate tables, no more barriers. Just family, brought together by healing's simple truth. Every journey begins with a single step. In the therapy room, Sarah was showing another new patient how to use the modified exercise equipment Anthony had designed. See? She demonstrated. Like they taught me, small movements, big progress. The message had spread beyond their small circle now. Other hospitals were adopting their methods. More kids were finding hope in gentle progress. Mr. Walker, Dr. Chin called from her office. A moment, she handed him a journal, a medical publication. Inside was their first official paper, documenting the success of his therapeutic approach. Your mother was wrong, Dr. Chin said quietly. You were born to heal. That evening, Anthony sat in his old spot in the garden. His textbooks laid open beside him, medical terminology mixing with memories of roses and determination. Emma joined him, walking steadily with just a light cane. First day survive? More than survive, he smiled. Felt right, like everything led here. Because it did, she sat beside him. Every step, every struggle, every small victory. Marcus appeared with pruning shears. Garden's not going to tend itself. Need help? Anthony offered. Nah, Marcus grinned. You taught me well. Though. He hesitated. Maybe you could show me some of those therapy techniques sometime? Got a cousin who could use help? Always, Anthony promised. That's how healing works. One person helps another, who helps another. As the sun set over Greenwich, Anthony looked at his hands. Hands that had learned to prune roses, ease pain, guide healing. Hands that had built bridges between worlds. His phone buzzed, a text from his grandmother. Mrs. Jenkins next door says thank you. Her arthritis exercises are working. Anthony smiled. Even now, the ripples spread. In his backpack, medical textbooks sat next to garden gloves. In the therapy room, children learned to trust their bodies again. In the mansion and beyond, healing moved in small, steady steps. And in a garden where hope once grew between roses, a boy who learned to heal had found his path home. The first stars appeared as Anthony gathered his books. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new chances to help. But tonight, in this garden where it all began, he knew the most important lesson of all. Healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about growing something beautiful in its place. One small step at a time.